What I wanted to do this evening was to talk to you a bit about some of the new conservative ideas, some of the new thinking going on within conservative circles in Britain. And perhaps I hope to stimulate some thought and discussions that I hope might be of some relevance to Israel. There is a great deal of new thinking within conservative circles in Britain. I preface my discussion about this by saying that a generation ago, the Conservative Party in Britain was incredibly successful at generating new ideas. We generated a whole raft of ideas in the 1970s and 80s, the shorthand for which is Thatcherism, where we redefined what it was to be conservative, and then in office we went on to redefine the role of the state. And it had a hugely powerful impact on Britain. And these were conservative ideas that had a huge relevance to the country. But Thatcherism in Britain was part of a wider conservative revival that was going on around the world. I think it probably began with Hayek's publication, The Road to Serfdom. And many of the Hayekian ideas throughout the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, they spread. They spread to think tanks in Westminster. They spread to the Chicago School, famously in America. These ideas fanned out around the world, and they had an enormous impact not only in the UK, they had a huge impact in Israel, in New Zealand, in the United States. In fact, there are countries in the developing world, in Africa, where these Hayekian memes and ideas had a huge impact. What I want to talk to you about is what is the next, what is it that is the next big conservative idea? And I think it can best be described as this. In the 70s and the 80s, British conservatism stood for decentralizing control over economic things. The marketplace decided how to allocate resources rather than central planners. The new conservatism is about decentralizing control not only over economic things, but over politics and over public services. In our book, The Plan, we described the way that you could end all planning. The plan, the title being deliberately ironic, suggested that in fact you could decentralize control over politics and public services in a way not unlike the way that we decentralized control over economic things in the 70s and the 80s. This new way of thinking is not a repudiation of Thatcherism. It is not, on the other hand, a reheating of Thatcherism. It is a post-Thatcherite conservative script. If I were to ask the question, did Thatcherism have failings, I would personally say no. I actually think Mrs. Thatcher was pretty close to perfect. Many of her ideas, I think, were spot on. I was a huge, and still am, a huge fan of hers. But I think there was nonetheless a certain paradox in Thatcherism in Britain. On the one hand, we decentralized control over the economy. Privatization, trade union reform, supply-side reform, Big Bang in the city, deregulation. But the paradox was that at the same time, we centralized control over politics and over public services. Indeed, we put in place much of the architecture of central control that has since actually, if anything, reversed the Thatcherite revolution. I'll give you examples. Over local government, under Mrs. Thatcher, we centralized control over how local authorities spent their money and raised their revenue and performed their functions. We centralized control over how public services were delivered. We put in place, for example, in education, a national curriculum. We set standards over the delivery of public services. We put in place the very architecture that over the past decade the centre-left government has used to actually micromanage the provision of public services. I think worst of all, we created an entirely new way of regulating. We may have privatized ownership over sectors of the economy, but we actually created a whole new system of regulation so that the state could regulate what it didn't actually own. We created a regulatory state. So that I don't think it's accurate just to look at Britain and look at the percentage of GDP consumed by the state as a total measure of government involvement in the economy and in civic society. You need to reflect on the fact that today the government increasingly regulates and controls things without actually owning them. In Britain, we use the term to describe this as the Quango state. Now, Quango stands for Quasi-Autonomous Non-Government Organisation. These are basically statutory agencies that are funded by the state, which exercise executive power, and which, although nominally accountable to ministers and nominally answerable to Parliament, in fact exercise executive power and regulatory power with almost no restraint. The Quango state has risen really quite recently. In the past 15 or 20 years, it has risen from humble origins, to the point where there is a huge sort of... the Quangos are known by the initials, so the Financial Service Authority, for example, is known as the FSA. There are so few initials in the alphabet, letters in the alphabet, they've actually run out of enough letters to describe them all. There are literally hundreds of these regulatory organisations that make decisions that were once made by elected officials accountable to Parliament. And we now see, and as a new MP, it struck me, I cannot make decisions or cannot hold to account the decision makers who make decisions that affect the lives of my constituents. For example, as a new MP, I met some people who had loved ones who were suffering from Alzheimer's. They wanted to know why their loved one couldn't get a drug. I met with the minister. The minister said, nothing to do with me. It was a range of these executive agencies that now decides how the health service is run. Throughout almost every sphere of public policy, you see the role of the regulatory state, the Quango state. And I think it's fair to say that most public policy in Britain is now determined by some form of executive agency or Quango or other. And indeed, it's a pretty shocking statistic that above all of these regulatory agencies within the UK is the European Commission in Brussels, which very often actually issues the directives that these regulatory agencies now follow. It's got so bad that something like 80% of all new rules and regulations made in Britain originate from the European Commission in Brussels. So we've created this hierarchical regulatory state that has actually taken over responsibilities that were once those left to democratically accountable officials. This has had a profound impact, particularly on politics in Britain. The first thing you'll notice is that turnout in Britain at elections has slumped pretty dramatically, I would say, as a consequence of this. Voters increasingly recognise that it doesn't matter who they vote for. If the person they elect doesn't actually run the health service or the justice system or the education system, they increasingly give up on voting for anyone. And we've seen turnout fall in the past 20 years pretty drastically. In fact, in local elections where the extent of micromanagement and the democratic recession has been greatest, we now see regularly turnouts of sort of 30–40%. In European elections, sometimes only 1 in 4 people able to vote will actually take part. This has had a profound impact, too, in the rise of political extremism in Britain. It is pretty shocking to think that in Britain, an extreme far-right party won seats in a national ballot for the first time since the 1930s. It is pretty shocking and I think quite disturbing to think that it is by no means inconceivable that these extremists could continue to win seats in national elections to the European Parliament, and I fear one day, even if we're not careful, to a national Parliament.